We are currently finishing up one of your handouts in Matthew chapter 6, and I'll invite you to open your Bible back there where we left off last time. We are in Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. We have been talking about giving in the beginning of the chapter, then gone on to talk about praying, and finally we're talking about fasting. And we got partway through that last week and had to close class because of time being up. And I gave you some things to think about last week. I hope that you have. Maybe you've come prepared to talk about a few things or some things you've thought about, things you found in the Bible, questions that you might have, particularly about fasting. Remember that we've been talking about righteousness and how it needs to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And then in chapter 6, we're seeing how hypocrites did certain things. And they were benevolent and giving in a way that was showy, called attention to themselves. They weren't doing it for the right reason. And the Lord told them that they wouldn't have any other reward than the approval of men that they were after. That's as far as that would go. Same thing with prayers that were said for the wrong reason in the wrong way. And now we're talking about the third topic of fasting. These are all illustrations of how our righteousness needs to be different from what they were doing. So when we're talking about this, we're reading verses 16 through 18. Let's refresh our minds with that reading again. Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance so that they will be noted by men when they're fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting will not be noticed by men, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So we asked a question last week about fasting. Is it ever commanded in the New Testament? What have you found? I see a couple heads shaking no. I don't see it commanded in the New Testament. All right. It's not commanded. What about this? Is it expected? It was expected of the Jews. Is it expected of Christians? I'm seeing a few heads nodding. You know, everybody watching this online they can't hear the rattle that far, so we have to speak up. That's Matthew 9 goes into it further. So what did you find in Matthew 9? Okay. So you have the disciples of John came and said, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And if you keep reading there is an expectation that at some point the followers of Christ would be fasting. And so you'll find that it's expected. We noted that in Acts 13, this is Christian era, when they were getting ready to send Paul and Barnabas out on the first missionary journey in Acts 13, they were fasting and praying at that point. These are Christians doing that. Then when they were on that first journey and they were appointing elders in all those locations where they'd converted people to Christ, in all of those cities, and appointing elders, they did that with fasting. Those are Christians who are doing that. When you get to Acts 27 and there's a shipwreck, there's fasting going on there for about 14 days. And Paul's encouraging them to take some food. And I wouldn't expect that, a majority of those on that shipwreck, I wouldn't expect them to be Christians. They were just scared. And they were not eating any food and hoping maybe God would smile on them and bless them through that situation. Then in Luke chapter 5, verse 35, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them. then they will fast in those days. So after the bridegroom, Jesus, is taken away, after his crucifixion, and certainly after his resurrection and ascension, there would be a cause for fasting in those days. Now, I did mention this in the Old Testament. You'll find one occasion in the Old Testament law where it was compulsory. It was commanded. Anybody remember what day that was that it was commanded for? Day of Atonement. There is language there in Leviticus 16:31 about humbling your souls. And that's a key phrase. We're going to run into that again because fasting is connected to the humbling of your souls. And it was commanded for the Day of Atonement. And then you're going to find, and Kevin found this one, was talking to me earlier in Ezra, when they were coming back from the area of Babylon back to Jerusalem, and they were encouraging in some of the work and the restoration that was going on there. There was fasting before they took that journey back to Jerusalem. But that was not Old Testament law. That was a different situation as they were coming back. Very stressful time, very important trip, facing many enemies along the way. Would God bless them in that? And there was fasting before they embarked on that journey from the area of Babylon back to Jerusalem. There's another text that I want to run across before we're done with that, and we'll do that momentarily. In the New Testament, though, it's voluntary. You don't find it commanded anywhere in the New Testament, but you do find it expected. It's sort of a thing that would occur along with prayer, along with benevolence. Those in Matthew 6 were not if you do it, but when you do it. So it's something that was expected, something that was ordinary behavior for God's people, Old Testament, New Testament, but it was not a command the way we have some other things in the New Testament. So it would be a part of a Christian's life in various circumstances. When would people fast? What do we mean by fasting? What's another way of saying that? Not eating. So fasting is not eating. But there's many times and many ways that we don't eat, and it might be for a lot of reasons, but there is a biblical reason to fast. And so when you put it in a Bible context, why would people fast? What was that about? Okay, so you have a mourning filled with sorrow situation where fasting might take place. When else? What else? Jesus fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and that was as he was embarking on his earthly ministry. Now remember, the Lord knew that the end of that ministry was going to be at the cross. This is his purpose for coming to earth. He's about to start that public ministry. He knows where it's going. He knows what this whole incarnation is about. Saving of souls. This is the most important thing taking place in human history, and there's a lot going on here. And he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights before doing that. When they were appointing those elders in Acts chapter 14, they were fasting. So you get the idea that on important occasions, important events, important in the eyes of God, for souls at stake, salvation is on the line, those kinds of situations, sorrow, very important events, you'll find things accompanying fasting along those lines. So abstaining from food for spiritual reasons, expressing grief, sometimes repentance, and devotion to God. You have that phrase, humbling your souls along with that. This is a posture before God. Humbling oneself before Him. Openness to God. to do His will rather than human will, to bow before Him. And so it's an openness to the work and the will of God, includes this element of humility along with it. I ask you another question before we get to our primary text on this. I asked you another question last week, and I made it kind of mysterious and vague. What is fasting not? And I kind of left it that way to make you think about it. There's a lot of things that people call fasting today that is not fasting the way it's taught in the Bible. It might be abstaining from food, but it's not what the Bible calls a fast. So what is fasting not biblically? What's one way that people use it today? Gwen? All right, getting ready for lab work, blood test. And they'll ask you, have you been fasting? And they want to know if you abstain from food and beverage other than water or maybe some coffee. Have you abstained from that for a certain number of hours so that your blood work will come out right for the doctor and they'll know how to read that and what that means. So sometimes for blood work. How else? Dieting. Sometimes people use fasting as a dieting method. They just don't eat for a while. I've had some people talk to me about, well, you know, every so often during the year, I'll go and do a fasting for body cleansing purposes. I want to do a body cleansing. So I'll go down to the health food store and I'll get these herbal things and maybe I'll eat that and then go on a body fast for so long and do a body cleansing. That's not biblical fasting. That's not what it's talking about. What else is it not? Sometimes religion gets kind of fancy and they want to advertise and draw a crowd. And they might advertise and say, all right, our church is going to be doing fasting. Aren't you interested in that? Isn't that mysterious? Haven't heard of that much, have you? We're going to do a fast. We're going to do a 3-day fast. Would you like to come and be a part of that with us? Our church is going to do a 3-day fast. Remember, it's not compulsory in the New Testament, not commanded in the New Testament, and it's not an advertising gimmick. It's not a church gimmick to draw a crowd. That's the wrong reason. It's the wrong thing. It's more like what they were doing in Matthew chapter 6 that Jesus is disciplining them over, wanting to do it for the approval of men, for the notice of men. That's not what a fast is. A fast is not about that. When you fast, you wash your face, comb your hair so that nobody will know you're doing it. Don't do it in an obvious way. Don't do it in a way to draw a crowd and attention to yourself. That's not what a biblical fast is. So it's not to draw a crowd. It's not one of those religious gimmicks. Sometimes people will do prayer the same way. All right, we're going to do an all-night prayer vigil. We're going to go from this time at night until the dawning of the sun the next day. You can come any time during the night that you want, and we'll be praying. We invite you to come in. Our doors will be open. How do you know when your prayer time's over? So when the sun rises, we're going to be all prayed out. We're going to have said everything that we need to say. And if we've said everything we need to say, and it's not dawned yet, we're going to keep praying. Sort of like Matthew 6, you're going to be heard for their many words. It's not a gimmick. It's not to draw a crowd. It's not to advertise. That's not what prayer is. It's not what fasting is. That's not what it's about. And so Jesus is correcting that sort of thinking, and now he's doing it with fasting the way he's done it with other things. A chapter in the Bible that I thought was very interesting about fasting, probably said more about it than a lot of other places in the Bible do, is back in the Old Testament in Isaiah chapter 58. And I'll invite you to turn there with me to Isaiah chapter 58. And God is rebuking His people there for their hypocrisy in fasting. So this is somewhat like 1 Corinthians 11 is to the Lord's Supper. You have a corrective text for the Lord's Supper. And in that corrective text in the New Testament, there's more said about the Lord's Supper in that correction than there is any other place. Well, in Isaiah 58, as God is correcting them for their hypocrisy in fasting, there's quite a bit said about fasting and what it's not and what it's supposed to be. They were using it as a badge to display their godliness to other people, to draw the attention of other people, the admiration of other people. And there's a text in chapter 58, and I'm going to read this from the New International Version. I think it's a little bit clearer than it is in some others. And so this is verse 3 through 6. Why have we fasted, they say, and you've not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves? There's that phrase. Why have we humbled ourselves and you've not noticed? Well, probably because they haven't humbled themselves. Well, why have we done this and you haven't noticed? Why have we so-called humbled ourselves and you've not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please. Now, wait a minute. Fasting is supposed to be to humble yourself, to do what the Lord pleases, not to do what you please, but your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I've chosen, only a day for a man to humble himself? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying on sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I've chosen? To loose the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to break every yoke. Interesting text, isn't it? It's not just, we're going to do it from this time to this time. We're going to call it a fast. We're going to say we're humbling ourselves before God. That's why we're doing it. But you don't actually do it. You just go on with life the way you've always gone on with life, doing whatever you feel like doing, and it doesn't change your relationship to other people. You still abuse other people. You still say the things you've always said, do the things you've always done, contrary to the will of God. But then you go through the process of fasting and say you're humbling yourself before God. That's not it. That's the same thing as going through 5 acts of worship on Sunday and saying, well, we've worshiped before God, but nothing's changed in your life. You're not any different than you were before. You haven't learned anything from the sermon. You haven't remembered anything in the Lord's Supper. The prayers that you said amen to haven't really changed what you're going to do when you open your eyes. The songs you've sung, the good hymns that remind you about God and truth and faith and challenge you to live a certain way, don't really make any difference. You're more concerned about if the beat of the song was done right or if it was in harmony or pitched right than you were the words that are supposed to change you. We can go through certain activities of worship and they don't make any difference, then that's not worship. They could go through the acts of fasting and really not humble themselves before God, even though they said they did. To me, that was a very interesting chapter to read, Isaiah 58. And maybe you want to spend a little more time there and see some things about that. So that's going to be important to understand about fasting and what it's about, the purpose of it, how it's supposed to change us, make us rethink some things in our relationship to God. Could be going through a very stressful time, seeking God's guidance about how to handle that, how to walk through that. Something else you'll find accompanying fasting most of the time when it comes up in the Bible is prayer. Prayer and fasting are like partners that go together Because when you look at what fasting is supposed to be, what the purpose of fasting is, you understand why prayer would be its partner. Why prayer would accompany it. Most of the time you read about fasting in the Bible, prayer's right along with it. And there's a reason for that. Humbling your souls before God, seeking His will in your life, prayer would naturally accompany that. You'll find that in Acts 13, Acts 14, for example, and a number of other places. What comments do you have about fasting before we move forward? All right, now we're coming to verses 19 through 21. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I wanted to include this section after we talked about those three illustrations, giving and prayer and fasting. I want to include this text, and we'll include it in the next handout as well. But I wanted to include it here because it's somewhat of a bridge text. And by that, I mean it has something to do with the text that's gone before it, and it's going to have something to do with the text that comes after it. So it acts like a bridge. It connects those three illustrations, and that's your reward then. If that's what you're doing it for, that's your reward. You'll get no reward from me. They were laying up treasure on earth. Jesus said, don't do that. That's where moth and rust will eat it away, and thieves break in and steal. That's very temporary. It's not what you should be after. So it connects to the text that's gone on before it. But then in verses 25 through 34, we have another topic. What's the end of the chapter about? Give it a word to summarize it. Worry. Worry about what? Food and clothing. Stuff. Stuff on earth, temporal stuff. So don't lay up treasure on heaven. Don't get focused on the temporal stuff so that it distracts you from the heavenly stuff. So this idea of laying up treasure on earth, it has to do with the things that have gone on before it, and it's going to have to do with what's going to be introduced after it. Worry over earthly stuff. Don't lay up treasure on earth. It's so temporary, and it's so vulnerable. I think I told you before, and I may still have this suit hanging in my closet. I have no idea why. It's when I didn't weigh as much, so it probably doesn't fit me. But man, I like that suit. It was a nice slate blue window pane suit. Loved it, fit me nice, was great. Gwen liked it. It made me like it even more. And so I have this suit, and a moth ate it. It's got moth holes in it. So it's hanging there. And I'm like, I don't even know if that can be fixed. I don't know. But even if it was, it probably wouldn't fit me anymore. But that's what happens to stuff on earth. Moths will eat it up. I have a lot of stuff that runs on batteries. You have a lot of stuff that runs on batteries? Did you ever look in there when, okay, it quits working? And so you say, okay, it needs new batteries, and you open it up, and what's happened is they've corroded. And it's eating everything up in there. New batteries won't help it at all. It's still not going to work. That's what happens to stuff on earth. Up in Michigan, one of the biggest plagues we had to buying a car is it would rust out in no time. Rocker panels, fenders, if you had that car for 2 or 3 years, you're going to have rust. Oh, they do undercoating and special stuff, and waxes didn't help it. So much salt on the roads in the wintertime, it would just eat it alive. That's what happens to stuff on earth. And thieves, they break in and steal, don't they? You know, literally, that break in, literally, that is, they dig through. The houses back then were made of mud brick. And so thieves would dig in. They'd dig through. And then they could reach their little hands in there and get your stuff. And so that's what thieves do. There is a translation of that in Matthew 6, verse 6. I'll see if I can find that real quick. Matthew 6, verse 6. When you pray, go into your inner room. Your inner room is, that's a room within the room. So that was a place as a storeroom that you would have so that thieves couldn't dig through the outer wall and just get to your stuff. So you had a room inside your room, your inner room. And that's a metaphor in Matthew 6:6. That's a metaphor for how you're going to pray. Go into your inner room, your room within your room. And it's a metaphor for what's going on inside of you. Don't just pray on the outside of you where people can see it, but be praying on the inside of you. In there, make it genuine, make it sincere, make it real. Your inner room. So there's a use of that terminology there. Everything on earth is temporary. Everything on earth is subject to laws. Well, with benevolence, prayer, and fasting, they're looking for that reward on earth, not heaven. They were using religion in a very shallow, earthbound way. If you're going to lay up treasure in heaven, don't expect much on earth. Don't expect much out of it. It's not going to reach heaven. It's not going to reach that level of reward. Now we're going to end up in this text on worry when we get to our next handout. So it's important with treasure, because where your treasure is, something else is there. What else is there where your treasure is? Your heart. That's the end of our text in this handout. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Your heartbeat of life. The things you long for, the things you focus on. Wherever your treasure is, whatever you're placing your value in, that's where your heart is. Who's supposed to have your heart? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. Well, if your treasure's in the wrong place, your heart's in the wrong place, therefore it doesn't belong to God. And that's what's going to drive your life, where your heart is, because it's after your treasure. And so that treasure becomes ultimately important. Proverbs 4:23, watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Guard it. All right, any comments before we close this section of our study? I do have another handout to give to you tonight. We probably have a few minutes to at least get that out and talk about it briefly. If I can get a couple of guys up here to help hand that out, we will get it out as quickly as we can to you. Thank you. This is Sermon on the Mount, Part 7. It's going to pick up in verse 22 and go through verse 34. Now, we're taking our time with the Sermon on the Mount. These are very significant words in the teaching of our Lord. What a concentrated section of the Lord's teaching goes on here. So this previous lesson discussing the disciples' religion, now we're talking about the disciples' ambition. So we move from giving, praying, fasting. We've come through this bridge text in verses 19 through 21, and it's leading to the latter part of the chapter having to do with ambition, worries, concerns, things that consume our thoughts, our time, our energy. So in between the disciples' religion, giving, praying, fasting, and the disciples' ambition, the things that we're so concerned about, we have two illustrations. Some might even call them a parable or like parables. The first one is that one about the treasure that we've just read about. The first one is that in verses 19 through 21, about where you're going to lay up treasure and what kind of treasure you're going to lay up. And then the second one is in verses 22 and 23 and has to do with the eye. The eye is like a lamp. And this particular lamp, the eye is like a lamp, and it lights up the house of your soul. So what do you look at? What do you focus on? What's got your attention? The eye is the lamp of the soul. It's what you're letting into your secret place. And then there's an application point to those when you get to verse 24 that you can only serve one master. So you need to pick your master. And that's what all of this is boiling down to in verse 24. You need to choose one master. You can't have two. We're getting ready to go to polishing the pulpit. Next week we leave. We won't be here on Wednesday. We'll be on the road. And we're heading over there. And where we stay is a cabin that we share with our son Eli, daughter-in-law Catherine, and their three little ones. That's really a blessed week because of the lessons at PTP, the fellowship at PTP, and then being with family and grandchildren there makes it all the more rich. Well, at this cabin, one of the things they've got is a little game system. And it's got a stool there and a stool there, and joysticks and buttons there, and the game's under glass there in the middle. And you take turns, and this one can see it from their side, and that one can see it from their side. It has all these games on it. Our little grandson, Micaiah, was it first grade now? And he loves that thing. He'll play that as long as his mom and dad will let him when he's at the cabin. And they let him spend a good amount of time on it. He looks forward to going there to be able to play those games. He's playing those games, and time comes for a problem to be solved. And Catherine, our daughter-in-law, needs his attention. And she calls him and gets him up off the stool and turns him to her. And she's disciplining him. And I'm sitting in a chair on the other side of the room. And I'm biting my cheeks. I'm doing all I can do because I don't want to laugh. But what he's doing is he's looking at his mom, and she's disciplining him, and his eyes, the game's still running. His eyes are looking over at that game, and she's got this arm, but this one's playing the button. He's still tapping that button and looking over there at that game out of the side of his eye. And you know what he had? He had two masters. And that's fine as long as they're in agreement with one another. But when they diverge, you're going to love one and hate the other. You're going to be devoted to one and despise the other. You're going to have to pick one. And he had that game as his master. And his mom was disciplining him and talking to him. And his eyes keep looking over at that game, and that little hand and those little fingers are going tap, 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 tap on that button. And he's just looking at his mom and looking over there. And I was just about to crack up. So I got up and I said, this is too much distraction. And I pulled the plug out of the wall. Now he's got one master. And we're learning about that in Matthew 6, verse 24. We learn about it in several illustrations of where you've got a wrong master. It's with the way we're going to worship God in the three illustrations that are there, what kind of treasure we're going to lay up, the things that we worry about. Pick a master. And if you pick the wrong one, it's not going to go the right way. And if you pick the right one, it's going to go the right way. And so there's the challenge, and verse 24 becomes a focal point as we go through that. Comments, ideas, anything you want to say?
I think that eye
Yeah, it is. It is something that is drawing in certain things into it, and you're focused on certain things so that you see those and not other things. It's choosing your priorities. And so it's the kind of treasure, what you're laying it up for, and the master that you're serving. Back to this text that we've just covered in 19 through 21 about treasures. Something I was noticing about this, I want you to go back with me to that model of prayer. Remember that back in chapter 6, that model of prayer? And I got to thinking about that model of prayer and how much that had to do with the rest of the chapter. I just want just something to think about with this and see if it makes any sense to you. Our Father, this is verses 9 and 10. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That begins with me. When I pray like that, and I open my eyes from that prayer, this begins with me and how I choose to live. If heaven's the goal, if the kingdom is the priority, am I living with those kinds of values? Am I treasuring up treasures on earth and temporal things, or is my focus in heaven? So when I'm praying a prayer like our Father in heaven, hallowed, holy be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth, that starts with me. What am I going to focus on when I open my eyes from a prayer like that? Are they going to be seeking the right kinds of things? Verse 11, give us this day our daily bread. Well, you end this chapter like verse 31, do not worry saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? The end of the chapter is focusing on stuff just like that. Give us this day our daily bread. But, verse 33, let me first seek your kingdom and your righteousness. Or am I focused on the daily bread stuff? And so you have that in that model of prayer. Am I trusting God to provide those things while I make Him first in my life? And then in verses 12 and 13, forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Forgiveness of sins, bringing that into the lives of other people, that's kingdom priority. That's what all of this is about. The forgiveness of sins. And so I'm supposed to take what I learn about that, and I'm supposed to project that into the lives of other people around me. That's kingdom priority stuff that's going on there. I just got to thinking about that model of prayer and how much that has to do with the rest of the chapter and Jesus realigning their priorities and the way they're thinking about stuff. It has a lot to do with that model. And that's sort of the way I was going through that and thinking about it. What else have you got? I heard a buzzer sneak in on us.
Verse 23 here in chapter 6 really raised the seriousness of what Jesus is saying here to me. So, verse 23 says, if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? That's maybe kind of a concerning verse, kind of a scary verse. Something that we really need to stop and reflect on is the light that's within us, is it really darkness or is it actually light? That's something that we absolutely need to make sure of. It's interesting, it's placed right before verse 24.
Yes, Adam's bringing up verse 23 and about the eye being bad and your whole body then being full of darkness rather than light. You're calling it a light, but is it a light? And so your eye is what you're looking at, what your priorities are, what you're longing for. And so if it's the wrong stuff, then the light that's in you, that's guiding your life, that's guiding your heart and your soul, that's actually darkness. And so when you get to other passages that talk about walking in light versus walking in darkness, that would fit in with this. What about the eye of your body? Is it good or is it bad? Is it working the way it's supposed to, or are you taking in things that are leading you a wrong direction? Now we're going to come back to that text next week, third week devotional, and so we'll pass over a week there. But then after that, we'll come back to this text. We're not done talking about this. We're going to talk a little bit more about the treasures, about the eyes, and about the masters. And I want you to notice something here. There's two treasures. There's two kinds of eyes. And there's two kinds of masters. Isn't that interesting when you see them in pairs like that? What's this all about? Make a choice. Bruce, comment? Okay, Bruce is bringing up, there's a lot of things we're talking about here. They're not bad in themselves. Some of them are neutral, and some of them are good. When you talk about prayer and fasting and giving and that sort of thing, those are good things. But they became bad by the way they did it. The same as money. Money's very neutral, but it's the love of money that's a root of evil. And so Jesus is talking about realigning those things, getting them in sync with Him as master. And when they get out of sync with that, then they produce bad. And so we'll come back in a couple of weeks and we'll talk about this. You've got your new handout so you can kind of see where we're going and do some preparatory reading and study because you've got the basic material there. And we'll come back and talk about it in class in a couple of weeks. Thank you for your attention. We are dismissed.